Coming up in part 3, I'm going to be applying some decals, making a complete backside of a pin wash, and then spending most of my time cleaning it up. And then I'm going to apply some grime effects to start the weathering process. But before we do any of that, if you like what you see, stick a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for future content. And I'll catch you in a sec. Hello and welcome back. Before we go any further, what we need to do is protect the paintwork that we did in part 2. So I'm going to add a coat of this VMS Satin Varnish across the whole model just to seal that paintwork in so that any of the following steps won't kind of reactivate the paint or damage it in any way. I also recommend using the satin or a gloss varnish at this stage and pretty much for most of the stages until you get right at the end of the model. Mainly, for one, it helps to prevent silvering on any decal sheets, the release liner that goes around the outside, the clear shiny bit really, helps reduce that. It's not going to totally get rid of it unless you use something like a Mr. Hobby very high gloss. But it also allows future coats like pin washers and oil washers and stuff to flow a lot easier because it's flattening out that surface rather than having the more porous surface of a matte finish. I'm using this satin, I really like it. I also use a high gloss of Mr. Hobby from time to time. I tend to do that more on aircraft when I want it kind of razor sharp accuracy. For the first stage, I'm going to be using microset. This helps soften and set the decal to the model, and it's a lot better than just using normal water. Then what you need to do is very carefully cut the decal from the decal sheet, either using a craft knife or scissors, making sure to get it as neat as you possibly can. Leaving a bit of the backing paper to grab on with some tweezers, and then just soak it in some warm water for about 10 seconds. While you're waiting for the decal to do its thing, apply a thin layer of the microset to the area you want to put it. But make sure not to put too much or soak it, but if you do, don't worry, just mop it up with a cotton bud or a piece of kitchen towel. After about a minute or so, the decals should really kind of start sliding about on the backing paper. And when that happens, what you need to do is very gently tease it off so that the edge is just hanging over and apply it to the model. Once the whole decal's on the model, just adjust it to suit with either something like, I'm using the back of a craft knife, but if you're not too comfortable with that, perhaps something like a toothpick or something not quite as sharp, till it's nice and straight and exactly where you need it. And then it's just a case of taking a cotton bud and gently rolling it over the surface just to make sure there's no air bubbles accumulated and that the decal's going to be nice and adhered to that micro set. Once you've done that, put the model to one side and let it dry. The next step is to start applying a couple of coats of microsol. This is a decal softener, so it may make your decal go quite wrinkly. Don't worry, don't touch it. It's designed to kind of shrink them and conform them to the surfaces and into panel lines and around raised surfaces and things. Put a couple of coats on, let it dry before you do anything else. Once you've applied all the decals to the model and everything's nice and dry, what you might notice, depending on the type of decals you've got, is that there's what they call sometimes silvering, or the decal might be raised, or you can see kind of the shiny outline around the decal, and it can be quite off-putting, but there's an easy fix for that. What you need to do is basically take, again, the satin VMS varnish that you used last time out, and put it on quite thick. It's kind of counterintuitive, but if you put it on thick enough, it's self-leveling, and it does works absolute magic. And what it does is it blends those out, and it makes those nasty silvering and shiny bits almost unnoticeable. I would highly recommend doing it, and I can't recommend the VMS stuff enough. Then I mix some Abteilung 502 oils with some white spirits. I'm using probably a small pea-sized blob of the engine grease, a little bit less on some raw umber, and then basically a brush full just of the faded navy blue so that you can keep that Panzer grey type feel and get that nice grimy colour that we're looking for. I have to hold my hands up on this one. I made a bit of a backside of the videoing side of things. I completely cocked the focus up, so a lot of it's quite blurry, I'm afraid. But basically all you need to do is just make sure your wash is nice and thin. In this instance I didn't thin it quite enough, which is why it kind of is well, it's kind of blobbing on the surface. It's not flowing as nicely as I would like. Easy way to avoid that, add a little drop of dish soap in, make sure to stir it through gently so you don't create any bubbles. And that'll just help act as a flow improver and let it run into all those panel lines. Then it's just a case of loading your brush up, going around the whole model in all the panel lines, recesses, rivets, hinges for hatches, anywhere that's got a recess to it, and just dropping it in there and letting it flow nicely and get into all those nooks and crannies. So you'll see that it's not the neatest of washes out there, but don't panic, don't worry, because what we've done is we've put a nice coat of satin varnish on there, which is going to protect the paintwork underneath, and any sort of white spirits that we're going to be using to clean it off ain't going to affect it. So the easiest way is, once it's dry, basically take a cotton bud or a small piece of kitchen towel and just wipe it off. And if it's a nice satin or gloss surface, it should just wipe off no problem. If you find that it's a little bit too stubborn, just wet your brush in some white spirit, wick it off a little bit onto a piece of towel, and then just wipe it off. Be as neat as you can, because obviously what you want to do is keep the wash in the recesses, in the panel lines, and create a bit of a false shadow around hinges and things. But tidying up is really straightforward, so you don't need to be too worried if you do make a bit of a mess of it like I've done. Then what I do is take some just clean white spirit straight out of the bottle and flood some of the areas where I want a bit more grime and a bit more weathering to take place. And this is kind of starting the weathering process properly now. And then I take an AK track wash. It's my really go-to wash for a lot of things. It's like browny, grimy type colour. It's a rusty colour. It's a really nice colour. And it's ideal for tracks, obviously. And basically take a brush full and just dot it into the white spirit, and what it'll start to do, it'll start to kind of pool out and flow and look very, very random. And if you find that you put too much on, or not enough on in this case, you can add a little bit more to it, take a little bit off, add a little bit more to it, and whilst it's like that, it's really, really workable. And because it's enamel, you can take it off with a bit thinners if you think that it's overdone, and just basically just work with it and use the inside of the pot, scrape some off the inside where it's a bit thicker if you want a bit more of a definition. And that's basically it. You just work with it until you're happy with the results. Let it dry fully before you start to think about tidying up. You can see here there's a few tide marks and things, but don't worry, they will all disappear, and you can tidy them up with different weathering processes further down the line. It does look very, very dark at the moment. Don't worry, it does dry much, much lighter, which is why I've gone a bit overboard with the colour there, you can see. But once it's all done, you should be left with something that looks a bit like this. I'm not sure quite what it's meant to be, but I really like it, and it's given that nice, dusty, dirty, grimy colour that I'm looking for on this build. Because I'm immensely impatient, I decided to use a hairdryer to speed along some of the oil washes and melt it apart. So I scratch built it. It's a little bit out of scale, but I don't think you'll notice it once it's all painted and weathered and there's stowage and stuff on there. But be warned, if you're using hairdryers, don't be a noob like me and leave it sitting for too long. Then I take this medium rust deposits, again from AK, and paint it on anywhere that I want kind of a rusty type feel to it. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail on this because it's a whole discipline in itself, and some people think it could be quite overdone, might not like it, might not be historically accurate, but I like it. And basically, whilst the medium rust deposit's still wet, I take the, again, AK track wash and drop it on there so that it flows in nicely and makes this blended for tones of browns and rusty colours. Then I wash the brush off and strip it away again, blending it like very gently, blending it together so that it forms this kind of rusty looking tone across the surface. Then with a mixture of various different oil paints, these ones are all out Tai Lung, it's my new favourite thing, I kind of dot them on in very vivid oranges, and I think that one's engine grease, just different colours, different tones of rust, just dot them on, blend them in nicely until you're happy with the result. One of the last things I'm doing on the build today in this video is doing a bit of chipping. I'm using a really light version of the base colour that I used. I put a lot more white and a lot more of the grey in there. And I'm just going around with a very fine brush in a very like juddery type of action. It's how I like to do it. You can use sponge chipping, you can do hairspray chipping. They're probably a video in themselves if I'm honest. But basically go around, putting where I think there's going to be a lot of wear and tear, tools being taken off surfaces, crew in and out of hatches, all that type of stuff. It looks a little bit over the top, but don't worry, it will kind of blend in. And then what I do is I take a chipping colour from ammo, and in the middle of each of those lighter chips, once they're nice and dry, I just paint a little tiny dot. And what that's going to do is hopefully give this 3D type of effect where the chip has gone right through down to the primer or down to the bare metal, and it's kind of rusted a wee bit over time, and give it a little bit more definition and a little bit more depth. Again, it looks a little bit OTT at the minute, but when you get kind of weathering powders and pigments and streaking and oils and stuff on there, it does tone right down. So don't panic if you think it's a little bit OTT, just go with it, and it does look really, really good at the end. I tell a lie, the chipping wasn't the last thing I did actually. I did a whole lot more because I didn't have actually any finished footage of the chipping stage done, so I kind of have to extend the video a little bit or else it just looks crap. But basically, I did a lot more of some streaking effects using various different Abteilung oil paints. In this instance I used Burnt Umber. Burnt Umber? Who the hell's Burnt Umber? Burnt Umber. And put a little tiny dot in, and then what I did was just basically drag it down with a moistened brush or moistened and white spirit brush. Just caught the right hand side of it, and then the left hand side, then the right hand side, and just gradually blended it in until you're left with a nice vertical streak running down the panel. And I did that with various different colours, blues because it'll kind of accentuate the Panzer Grey, buffs, whites, browns, blacks, all sorts of different colours, so that I felt appropriate. And it's probably up to you to have a bit of a play and see what you think of it. And then after that, I basically went around just painting all the bits and bobs like the stowage, putting metallics here and there, just to make certain little metallic details pop a little bit better. But again, the weathering's going to be covering all of this, so you don't need to be too neat at this stage. Things like tarpaulins I did, the various cloths and stuff like that are dotted about the tank, and the shovels and the Pioneer equipment and stuff like that, I painted those up as well. And that's it for today. I've covered a lot of ground and I've glossed over some of the techniques, I admit, but some of the ones I've used deserve more in-depth videos basically, and I'll definitely get around to doing them sometime in the future. Part 4 of Stug Life will come out soon, and I'll be getting down and dirty with some mud and grime effects and finishing off the build. Apologies for the slower output, but a man's got to work. As always, I hope at least one person out there has learned something, and if you like this video, don't forget to smash that like button, and if you want to see more of what I do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching, stay safe, and bye bye.